Bona tarda i moltes gràcies per haver vingut. És un dia important, diguéssim, hi ha activitats europees que ens distreuen, però em sembla que l'acte d'avui realment ens satisfarà enormement. Jo soc Miquel Strubel, soc secretari de la Càtedra de Multilinguisme, Lingua Món Woc, i hem aprofitat el fet que el professor David Laitin venia des de França a participar en un congrés per demanar que ens parlés d'algun dels temes que està investigant últimament. El professor Laitin és un vell amic. Als anys 80 va venir diverses vegades a estudiar, com a politòleg que és, doncs l'evolució, la transició política a l'estat espanyol i molt en particular a Catalunya, i mirant a veure les opcions de política lingüística que estaven, diguéssim, damunt la taula i que la Generalitat i el Parlament podien adoptar per tirar endavant un procés de el que nosaltres diem normalització, però és un terme que en cada llengua vol dir una cosa diferent. I el fet que ell durant els anys 80 i 90 escrivís primer sobre el nostre cas i després comparant, per exemple, el nostre cas amb Estònia i després treballant a diferents països, per exemple a l'Àfrica, i aplicant teories com la teoria del joc i el tipping point, no sé com s'ha de traduir, el decantament, el canvi de normes, diguéssim, dins de la societat, tot això ha fet que tingui un bagatge enormement ric. Ens satisfà que hagi guanyat premis pel millor article de l'any en ciències polítiques, havent escrit sobre temes catalans, aquests articles en concret, i ens satisfà enormement que hagi volgut tornar aquí avui a parlar d'un tema, diguéssim, d'interès mundial, com és la relació entre el grau de desenvolupament, riquesa, pobresa, per un cantó, i el multilingüisme per l'altre. Investigarà si hi ha relacions causals entre un i altre a partir d'unes recerques empíriques, i espero que hi haurà temps després per un debat. Finalment, si hi ha algú que s'ha assabentat d'aquest acte per una via molt indirecta i vol rebre en el futur informació sobre les nostres activitats, sapigueu que a la pàgina web de la uoc.edu trobareu la pàgina de la Càtedra de Multilingüisme, i si no, si ens deixeu una adreça electrònica us anirem informant. Hi ha l'Alexia allà darrere que saluda i que us prendrà, si voleu, la informació. David, endavant. Up to you.
Political science hopes to be a predictive discipline, and so I will start off by making a prediction and then get on with the basis of the talk. The prediction is Barca 1, Chelsea 0. I will try to talk fast so you will be able to enjoy the game and not hear the end of an academic lecture. Let me start off with what I call the problem of linguistic normalization in Catalonia. What brought me to Catalonia in 1984, having studied the failure of nationalist language programs in Africa, was the sense of success, the sense of future of the normalization movement in Catalonia, that I took the image of the Sardona of Picasso's drawings as an exemplar, and said, here we have a society of jubilant nationalists who will dance under the sun in enjoyment of their nationalist togetherness or sharing a common Catalan nation. Much to my chagrin, upon arrival in Catalonia in 1984 and living in Les Corts and going to my first Sardana in Sarrià, it didn't look at all like this. Businessmen were coming from their work at 8 p.m. And shoppers were coming from Corte Inglés, and they all didn't have the sun in the center, but they had their wealth, their briefcases, their shopping, and they had devised an urban dance that allowed them to keep full attention on their money. This was not a society of jubilant nationalists. This was a very urban bourgeois society that was engaged in hard work, in commercial enterprise, and in fact it was bankers that led the law of linguistic normalization in Convergencia rather than peasants or happy little stick figures dancing around or dancing under the sun. This program of linguistic normalization increased the communicative range of Catalans by 0. That there was no one after normalization that people were able to speak to that they couldn't speak to before. For a calculating people who devise an urban dance where they can watch their money, it was unusual or demanded explanation of what explained their fervent linguistic nationalism. What cost have the Catalans paid for their nationalism? The next to last line here, what explains their fervent linguistic nationalism, is a talk I've given here in Pompeo Fabra and other places several times, and I will only spend a few moments addressing because I was asked to think with new data and new thinking to change some of my earlier views about what the actual costs have been and what Catalans have paid for this nationalist enterprise. So that's the agenda. The next to last question, what explains their fervent linguistic nationalism, will be discussed in the next couple of slides, and then most of the talk on the final question. So this is an anti-Picasso explanation for linguistic nationalism, and as Miguel Strubel has explained, it uses what's known as a teoria de jocs or game theory to give an explanation. And I call this the language tipping game applied to Catalonia. And I'm going to try to explain this clever diagram, which I've borrowed from Thomas Schelling, and apply it to language. Think of this horizontal axis as measuring the percentage of students whose medium of instruction in Catalonia is in one language or the other. Over here, 100% have Spanish as the medium of instruction. Over here, 100% have Catalan as the medium of instruction. These two lines represent the value to each individual in the yellow line if Catalan is the medium of instruction, and in the red line if Spanish is the medium of instruction. At the vertical axis, is call it the payoff, that is, the value, the amount the person will get from, whether it be money or status or enjoyment. Think of this as a payoff, the value to the person at each point on the horizontal axis. The general point of this model is to say, if 100% of the people, the students, are studying in Spanish, the value of studying in Catalan is very low because you'll have no one to talk to. So the value of Spanish is higher for each individual than the value for Catalan if everyone is studying Spanish. This is what Schelling calls the coordination aspect of language. Am I speaking clear enough for you? If 100% are having their children educated in Catalan, the value to each individual of speaking Catalan is greater than the value of speaking or having your child learning in Spanish. This is to say that language is not like football, where there's one winner and one loser. Language, you're both winners if you're using the same language. So coordination is the key. Now, some people may prefer to coordinate here, and other people may want to coordinate here, but it's always better to coordinate than not to. In this particular representation of the graph, the value for speaking Spanish or having your child learn in Spanish is higher if everyone speaks Spanish than the value of Catalan if everyone is learning in Catalan. If you make the line across here, the value you get at 100 Catalan is lower than the value of 100 in Spanish and speaking Spanish. But that's only an assumption. The idea that if the coordination is in Spanish, the trade with the entire Hispanic world and the coordination with the rest of the peninsula will make people better off. But that's an assumption which I'm going to be examining later on. This point K is the point we call the tipping point. Every point over here to the left of K, if someone has his child studying in Catalan, it's rational for them to send their kid to a Spanish school because the value would be higher. Every point to the left of the tipping point, it's rational for someone to send their kid from Catalan school to Spanish school until you reach here at 0 in Catalan schools. Once you pass this point, it's irrational to send your kid to a Spanish medium school, and you get more value in a Catalan medium school, and that leads to the second equilibrium, 100% Catalan. So there are two equilibria in this game, 100% Catalan and 100% Spanish. And the key to linguistic normalization is moving the population from here, 1975, to here. And that's the burden. And in the study of economics, there's no theory about moving from one equilibrium to another. There's no theory about how you get from one equilibrium to another, because that's a political story. That was 10 years of work. So how was the tip achieved? I believe the tip was achieved, but there's still some question of whether normalization has been achieved here. But in terms of basic education, medium of instruction in Catalonia, Catalan is considered the obvious language for medium of instruction for residents in Catalonia. It's clear that in the late 1970s, there was a post-Franco moment when dictatorship dictatorship in the public mind was combined with anti-pluralism. And being an anti-authoritarian meant being, for many, pro-plural. It was a moment when Franco was so associated with not only dictatorship, but anti-pluralism, that it was a very acceptable democratic move in the 1970s to say, for the Catalans to say in Madrid that we will not participate in the democratization of Spain unless we get autonomy, which will involve linguistic normalization. So it was a moment, a historic moment that the Catalans took advantage of and made it their bargaining position for entry into the Spanish government, or in the democratic process. This gave people the sense that it was inevitable that the Catalans would have autonomy and the Catalans would be able to successfully implement a normalization project. But there were other factors that led to success. What I call the private subversion of a public good. I tell this line all the time from United States. An American humorist, Will Rogers, wrote on the 1910 ballot in Oklahoma, voters rejected an initiative to allow liquor sales in cities, which had been prohibited in Oklahoma's original constitution. It was the first of several prohibition repeal initiatives. And Will Rogers later would say, Oklahomans vote dry, that is for prohibition, as long as they can stagger to the polls. The application to Catalonia is Catalans will vote for Catalan nationalism as long as they can send their kids to English-speaking schools. So you get all the pleasure of being a nationalist by voting for nationalist programs, just as long as if you have the money, you can send your kids to Oxford or whatever so that they can participate in the international labor market. So in a sense, people were voting for it because they were rich enough to subvert it. People were voting for it because they were rich enough to subvert it. There's a third factor, one that involved humiliation, what I call the work of linguistic vigilantes. And when I was living in Catalonia and Barcelona, you would often see on the buses, if a bus driver answered a person coming on the bus who asked a question in Catalan, if they answered it in Castilian, some person in the bus would excoriate the bus driver, saying, you must answer in Catalan, humiliating people for not responding in Catalan. So I reached this observation once. I regularly took the metro from Maria Cristina station in Les Corts to downtown, and I would see many people sitting in the metro, and you'd see them reading Avui. And in that period, I don't know about now, but in that period, Avui didn't have very much news in it. And I was amazed that people were buying Avui and reading Avui when you had two world-class newspapers here, until I peeked behind the Avui and found that they were really reading La Vanguardia, but were avoiding humiliation by having other people think they were reading Avui. This is a sign that people saw there would be humiliation if they were not linguistic nationalists. And the sense that people were avoiding humiliation was a sense that this tipping point was imminent. So all sorts of social processes worked to the benefit of people thinking that the tipping point, would be reached, and therefore it would be good for them to have their children in Catalan schools and learning Catalan themselves, rather than have others learn it first and be ahead of their own children in the Catalan labor market. The assumption of the model that there was a cost to pay was a reasonable assumption. Why was it a reasonable assumption? That is, the Catalans paid a cost for their nationalism. There is an algorithm, we call it in political science ELF, ethnic linguistic fractionalization. What ELF measures is the probability you will, if you're randomly matched with someone else in your country, whether you'll speak a different language from that person or have a different mother tongue from that person. So think of ELF as the probability, if you're randomly matched with someone, that you'll have a different mother tongue. The formula for ethnic linguistic fractionalization is 1 minus the sum of the squared percentages of each mother tongue group. This ranges from 0, I'll get to this, it ranges from 0 in some countries like Belarus to about 0.98 in countries like Tanzania. In Tanzania, there's a 98% chance, if you're randomly matched with someone, that you'll speak a different, have a different mother tongue. In Belarus, the chance is virtually 0. Now, to go back on the slide I was just at, if you take the 3 tresiles of ethnic fractionalization, that is, the ones below 0.227, that is the most homogeneous countries, the ones over 0.589, the most heterogeneous countries, and the middle tresile between those two, and you look at the average gross domestic product in 1999, you'll see that the most homogeneous countries are incredibly richer than the most heterogeneous, and somewhat richer than the middle tresile. So the assumption that the political act to create greater multilingualism in Spain made the country subject to less wealth is a reasonable assumption, and should be troubling to anybody who tries to promote pluralism in their country. Ethnic fractionalization correlates negatively with country wealth, leading to the question, does language diversity breed poverty, and how costly has been the promotion of linguistic diversity in Spain? Now I'm starting for the project that was advertised. How do I think through this issue of the cost Catalans have paid, or the cost all Spaniards have paid, for Catalan nationalism? Is Spain paying an economic cost for the politically inspired increase in ethnic linguistic fractionalization? As I said, I had long assumed that Spaniards in general and Catalans in particular have paid an enormous, or paid an economic cost for normalization, though a cost the majority of Catalans were willing to pay. I have no brief against willingness to pay a cost to have something you want, like your own language. I'm only wanting to know how to measure that cost. And the presentation today challenges my assumption with new, though still preliminary data, and by examining the supposed causal pathways from ethnic linguistic fractionalization to poverty. So, what's the path, the pathway from multilingualism to poverty? Max Weber, the great late 19th and early 20th century sociologist, had this concept which he called rationalization. What states do, he argued, is rationalize society. They unify weights and measures. So if everyone agrees on the pound or the pint or the kilogram or the quart, If everyone agrees on the weights and measures, trade becomes much easier. If everybody agrees on the legal rules of what practices are allowed in trade and who is guilty if there is personal injury, it's easier to have contracts. If everyone shares the same currency, it's much easier to have commerce. So what a delight it is for me to come here from France and to be able to use the same currency, especially after having come back from St. Petersburg to France 2 weeks ago and losing 30% of my honorarium because of the exchange thieves, we'll call them. Max Weber might also have added language, although he didn't, to this list of rationalized institutions. The extent to which people speak the same language, trade and commerce and interaction, scientific interaction, is far quicker. In fact, we now have data to show the diffusion of patents from the place where a patent was originally accepted goes through cultural similarity. The more culturally similar, the more quickly a patent will diffuse to another country. So in a sense, sharing culture or sharing a language has a tremendous advantage from a Weberian point of view for rationalized, for economic growth. Economic growth is fostered by rationalization, common language, common weights and measures, common currency, common legal system. Well, those of you who study language should know about SIL, the Summer Institute of Languages. It's the best data set in the world for knowing the spread of languages in every country in the world, as well as the percentage of people in the world that speak every language. So it's organized by both language and by country. It's a magnificent data set. It was organized by Baptists who were trying to have Bibles translated into every language. And linguists, professional linguists, tend to scorn SIL, but there's no better source. So SIL provides data on the number of indigenous languages as mother tongue within each country of the world. And multilingualism is a measure of the number of indigenous languages per square kilometer. So we know for every country in the world the degree of multilingualism. That is the number of indigenous languages per square kilometer. Stateless societies I define as, that is non-Weberian societies, as those countries that received independence after 1830, but were not once ancient monarchies. So Burma got its independence after 1830, but was an ancient monarchy. I call stateless societies like Tanzania, which got its independence after 1830, but there was no Tanzanian monarchy. Tanzania represents everything that's not stateless. And you look at the multilingualism measure from the bottom 5 to the top 5 countries. Belarus, North Korea, Uruguay, Cuba, and South Korea have the fewest indigenous languages in the SIL data set. Papua New Guinea has 820, Indonesia 737, Singapore has a high multilingualism measure because they have very few square kilometers. So these are the 5 most multilingual and the 5 least multilingual countries in the world today from the SIL data on multilingualism. So then I look at state versus stateless societies and find that the multilingualism score is no different for state societies and stateless societies. Same number of, basically the same number of indigenous languages per square kilometer, or living indigenous languages per square kilometer. Therefore, it does not seem, there's no correlation whatsoever. It says p equals 0.42. For it to be any kind of a significant relationship, we say p has to be less than 0.05. So it's not significant at all. Therefore, stateness does not seem to lead to lower levels of societal multilingualism. This leads to the second line of inquiry, some of the most interesting material that I have not myself fully digested. Does geography explain multilingualism? It does. The closer you are to the equator, the darker lines mean higher multilingualism. The darker spots, the closer you are to the equator, the more languages there are per square kilometer. This is exactly the same with plant species, but why we should have this for languages is unknown. Nonetheless, multilingualism is a function of being near the equator. And as you can probably think ahead, being near the equator also is correlated with low GDP per capita. So this may be a false analogy, a false relationship between multilingualism and poverty. It's really being near the equator. Second, multilingualism and climate soil. There's a wonderful book on multilingualism by a scholar named David Laitin from the UK. And what he found is the mean growing season, even controlling for distance from the equator, the mean growing season, that is average across all measuring stations in the country, correlates very well with multilingualism. Here, P is way below 0.05, meaning that it's an absolutely strong, significant relationship. The longer the growing season, Nettle argues, or interprets, the lower the risk of starvation. And the lower the risk of starvation, the less need to establish close social relations with neighbors by learning their language or merging the languages. Therefore, the longer your growing season, the more likely you're to be separate from your geographic neighbors, and therefore have more languages per square kilometer in your region. Multilingualism in mountains. For each 1,000 feet of elevation, from the highest to the lowest point in the country, the log of multilingualism goes up by 0.27. Here is a map of one of the islands of Papua New Guinea, the most linguistically diverse country in the world, which goes from 0 to fairly high altitudes. And that's true for most of Papua New Guinea, where you have loads of different ecological zones and also hidden areas in mountains where small linguistic groups are able to thrive. So the three variables so far, proximity to the equator, mean growing season, and multilingualism, make stateness irrelevant to the number of languages or the degree of linguistic pluralism in the country. The fourth geographic variable, I'm sorry to report, is not significant, but it's so interesting I have to go through it with you. One of the most famous books, bestseller books in the past 20 years in the Western world is a book by Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel. How many of you know this book? Well, he's done most of his. He's a what do you call a plant specialist in not zoology, but botany, comparative botany, basically. And he's a brilliant micro scientist. And This book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, starts off and asks the simple question, why is New Guinea impoverished and England rich? Do we have an answer to this question? And then he asks another fascinating question. When Pizarro came to Peru, why did the Indians die but not the Spaniards? And he has a set of answers to these questions which are thoroughly original. But the one I'm going to bring, the answer I'm going to bring to your attention now is that in continents where the mountain ranges went north-south, the only easy way to migrate was north-south in the valleys. But if you migrate north-south, your technology is not appropriate as you move south or as you move north, because it's a different, as you move down or up in latitude, the kinds of plants and the kinds of agriculture possible changes. So in North and South America, or South America, with north-south as being the major form of migration, you got high levels of multilingualism because it was virtually impossible to conquer groups to the north or south of you because you had to borrow their technology and then borrow their language. However, in Eurasia, the migration pattern was east-west. And there, conquering tribes could use their agricultural technology successfully, and force the people to assimilate to their culture. Therefore, you were able to get much larger states, much larger social organizations, and therefore, higher levels of development. It's a very, very clever argument. So I tested this by looking at the ratio of every country in the world of north-south versus east-west, and to ask, if the country were longer, would it be richer? And unfortunately, the answer was no. No relationship. And if you might think, there are only 7 continents, so Diamond couldn't do a statistical analysis. There weren't enough observations to do a statistical analysis by continent, but you can do a statistical analysis by country. And the statistical analysis fails. So the one geographic factor, that is the degree to which a country expanded east-west as opposed to north-south, does not come out as significant. But what we see here is that 3 of the geographic variables, elevation difference, distance from the equator, and mean growing season, are all significant. And stateness and ratio north to southeast, north-south, east-west, is not significant. I have 0.61 and 0.42 as the t-statistics, which are nothing. You need at least 2 to have any degree of significance. Geography also matters for economic growth. So I've taken 4 countries, that some of you might know, to bring it down to reality, rather than give you the 175 countries from which the data set is developed: Nigeria, Mexico, Spain, and France. And as you see, I've gone from the lowest GDP per capita, the poorest country, to the richest country, based in data from a decade ago, 1999. And as we see, ratio east-west, north-south goes up and down, no relationship to this pattern. There's nothing there. Distance from equator, it's pretty amazing. That's the capital city's distance from the equator. It just works quite properly. You enjoy sun here in Spain compared to France, but your 6 degrees of distance from the equator has implications for GDP per cap. Mountainous terrain, well, we see for these three countries, again, working in the direction that you would say the less mountainous terrain, the higher the GDP per cap, except for Nigeria being the exception. And we could say, or might say, if we wanted to save the theory, that having high degrees of jungles and savanna has the same effect of mountains, that is separating peoples. So distance from the equator is a perfect fit. Percentage of mountainous terrain works, except for Nigeria. And ratio, that is north-south, east-west, ratio has no predictive power. So it looks like we're becoming geographic determinists by saying that what matters is how far Spain is from the equator, and has nothing to do with Catalan normalization. Well, is multilingualism itself harmful to economic growth? I've taken the same 4 countries with the GDP per cap going up, and the number of languages spoken by greater than 5% of the population. Not a bad relationship. It seems like it's not perfect here, that Mexico only has 2, Spain has 4, but the relationship is generally down. That is, the more languages spoken by more than 5% of the population, on average, the GDP goes down. Ethnic fractionalization, this too works pretty well. Spain is 0.44, which means that there's a 44% chance if 2 Spaniards are randomly matched that they will have a different mother tongue. Numbers of indigenous languages, multilingualism, and plural. Plural is kind of interesting. Plural means the percentage whose mother tongue is the dominant language. In Spain, it's 0.68. In France, it's 0.85. In Nigeria, it's 0.29. And Mexico, 0.6. This seems to be a key predictor of GDP per cap. That is, the number of people whose mother tongue is the dominant language of the country. Can states reduce the costs of diversity? So going back to state and stateless societies, the percentage of people who speak the dominant language, in state societies it's 78%, in stateless societies it's 60%. That's the key. It's not the number of languages that predicts growth, but the percentage who speak the dominant language. Number of viable languages spoken by greater than 5% of the population of all the living languages. Stateless societies have many tiny languages which are viable, of spoken less than 5% of the population. And GDP per cap for state societies is 8.8. For stateless societies is 3.5. So in a sense, what states seem to do is have coordination amongst all the languages in the country. Coordination on one language is dominant. That the number of languages spoken by 5% of less than 5% of the population tend to disappear, and this relates to high GDP per cap. This, I believe, is the next to last slide. So, the GDP per cap, again, of the 4 countries, we see that in ancient kingdom, or longevity of state institutions, so this is a nice one, the era of universal public education. The earlier public education, national public education, came to the country, the higher the GDP. And this is key because the era of public education tends to bring plural, that is the number of people who speak the dominant language of the state, tends to raise that and eliminate the tiny languages. So early public education is a good predictor of high GDP per cap. The year the country entered the international system, 1816 is the earliest when we have data, but the earlier the country comes into the international system, the higher the GDP per cap. So we could say these two variables are variables that create centralized states that bring a good deal of unity to the country's linguistic population and tend to eliminate tiny languages through the school system. Is there a single official state language? Most of the richer countries do have a single official state language. And are regional languages given official status? This is the one which is interesting and the new area for research. There's no clear pattern here. And what we find in the statistical work, by granting regional linguistic autonomy, a positive and significant relationship between state recognition of regional languages and higher GDP per cap. Probability 0.04, which means it's significant. What this is saying is that if the country has had an early education system controlling for this and controlling for early entry of the state into the international system, by granting minority languages linguistic recognition, this will, on average, raise the GDP per cap. That's the new finding. I haven't fully developed yet, but I did it for this talk. So, a few conclusions. Levels of multilingualism are not different for state and stateless societies. There's a number of languages spoken as a mother tongue in the country. But multilingualism is a function, and the reason for this is multilingualism is a function of geography, elevation differences, proximity to the equator, and mean growing season. So it has not much to do with state or statelessness, but rather distance from the equator, elevation differences, and mean growing season, especially for agricultural societies. For poverty, ELF negatively and the size of the dominant linguistic group positively are statistically related. That is to say that the higher the homogeneity of the country and the larger the dominant linguistic group, the more likely the country will be richer. And that leads to the final bullet, if it's still here. However, well-institutionalized states with national education systems and long membership in the international community, those states that create, that have a single official language, that create national education systems and have a single official language are positively associated with wealth. Sorry, this is the bullet point. But the preliminary finding in the Catalan normalization question, granting regional autonomy to small regional groups in those highly institutionalized states seems to have, from initial data analysis, macroeconomic benefits, undermining the assumption in an earlier slide that went into the tipping game.
That was very stimulating. Thank you very much indeed. Would you be prepared to answer questions? Hi ha preguntes, endavant. Si podeu dir el nom primer, anirà bé. No sé si podreu traduir la pregunta perquè no hi ha micròfon. Sí que n'hi ha. Isidor, sí, endavant. Sí.
Gràcies. Espero que la traducció permeti entendre correctament la meva pregunta. M'ha semblat molt interessant tot aquest joc de correlacions entre el multilingüisme i diferents factors. Però m'ha sorprès una mica la mesura del multilingüisme en el sentit que es doni importància al nombre de llengües per quilòmetre quadrat i, en canvi, no es faci la correlació que a mi em semblaria que també pot donar resultats interessants entre el nombre de persones que dominen diferents llengües, és a dir, el nombre de persones multilingües dins d'un estat, o el nombre de persones monolingües dins d'un estat, i la correlació que hi ha en aquests percentatges de població monolingüe i població multilingüe amb tots els altres factors de pobresa, de desenvolupament, etc. Perquè crec que aquí hi ha una dada significativa. Hi ha una diferència de comportaments socials i polítics molt grans segons els països en què la majoria és monolingüe o majoritàriament monolingüe, o que països en què la immensa majoria de la població, com pot ser el cas de Luxemburg, són competents amb 3 o 4 llengües. Crec que aquest és un factor, no sé si vostè ho ha estudiat, però suggereixo que donaria també resultats interessants.
Thank you for that question. I'll make 2 points. One, I believe and have argued elsewhere that India is a 20th century state in which multilingual repertoires, what I call 3 plus or minus 1 languages, is becoming a norm for 20th century and 21st century states. In India, everyone who wants a range of opportunities needs to speak Hindi, the language of popular culture and urban life, needs to speak English, the language of higher business, and needs to speak his or her state language to get into a hospital, to get into grade school, to do normal business in the state. That's a 3-language outcome. If you're a minority in the state, say a Marathi speaker in the state of Karnataka, you have a right to have your child educated in Marathi, which would be 3 plus 1 languages. If you live in a state where Hindi is a state language, say Bihar, you only need 3 minus 1 or 2 languages. And the country works perfectly with a set of multilingual repertoires. I believe that Europe is becoming a 21st century state. Everyone in Europe knows that they need to know English if they're going to have opportunities in the Union. The state languages are not going to die, and more regions are able to promote their regional languages. So you have a 2 plus or minus 1 language situation. In Catalonia, English, Spanish, Catalan, 2 plus 1, and in England, English, 2 minus 1. And in France, 2, French and English. So multilingual repertoires are becoming the norm for states that are created in the last century, as India and European Union are. So I agree with the premise that multilingualism has properties very similar to high plural, that is, a great deal of unity. One problem is, not in terms of the solution, but in terms of measuring this, is that linguists have not given us the tools to measure multilingualism. When I was doing research in Estonia, we asked Russians Russians living in Estonia in 1994 whether they spoke Estonian. The answer was, oh yes. And we wrote down on our questionnaires, yes. By 1999, when my work was being replicated by students at Tartu, they asked Russians if they spoke Estonian, and the answers were largely no. Even though the level of Estonian had gone up amongst the Russians, their criteria for what constituted speaking Estonian went up faster. And therefore, there isn't a standard data set that would say the degree to which there is multilingualism in the degree to which with individual multilingualism in societies which are societally multilingual will be better off. But your conjecture that they will be better off is what I think is correct.
Mi nombre es Pujol, Jordi Pujol, Esquerre, no Soler. Bien, yo tenía aquí 8, 9, 10 cuestiones para plantearle, pero como no da tiempo y son muy delicadas, esperaré a poderlas tratar con su reina de Inglaterra, Elizabeth, que me parece que será un interlocutor más válido. Ahora quería formularle una pequeña pregunta. Donde han habido 2 cismas, ¿puede haber un tercer cisma? Es posible, ¿no? El cisma de Oriente, el cisma de Occidente, y ahora podría haber otro cisma. No es improbable, ¿verdad? Matemáticamente y lógicamente.
Potser podíem acumular preguntes i després farà respostes a les diferents preguntes plantejades. Jo mateix volia fer una pregunta. Ha parlat del fet de països en què s'han reconegut oficialment les llengües regionals i ara posaríem l'estat espanyol en aquesta llista, però fa 40 anys, vostè sap perfectament, que no hi hauria estat en aquesta llista. I la pregunta seria si al llarg del temps podríem preveure una diferència en el desenvolupament econòmic que estigui correlacionat amb aquesta diferència d'estatus i de reconeixement oficial. O dit d'una altra manera, si el fet de reconèixer el català, el basc i el gallec allibera un potencial o frena un potencial econòmic. No sé si m'he explicat bé.
Yes, that's extremely important that the data I presented and been working on for the past several weeks for preparation is all what we call cross-sectional, comparing countries with and without recognition at a certain point in time, say 1999. And Miguel is asking, the real test is time series, that if you have a prediction about a country's growth of GDP per cap, and then you have an intervention by the state recognizing languages which it previously had not recognized, would that slope change that can be attributed to the change in policy? And the technology we have enables us to answer that question, but I haven't gotten to it yet.
Doncs, si no hi ha més preguntes, faria una última pregunta, abusant de la meva posició aquí. I seria si veiem una correlació entre el declivi en la diversitat lingüística, que vostè comenta, i un augment en el producte interior brut, si aquests dos processos potser no tenen una relació causal directa, sinó que potser són conseqüències, per exemple, d'un estat fort i modernitzat, no amb aquestes finalitats, però amb aquestes conseqüències. És a dir, el que ha dit fins ara, més o menys parlàveu d'una relació causal entre el desenvolupament i el multilingüisme, una relació causal negativa, però jo em demano si no hi ha un altre factor intermedi que fa que no tinguin una relació directa, sinó indirecta.
This is once you have statistical correlations, the next step is to theorize and say, why are we getting them? What's the causal story here? And one causal story that I've been working on, and it's in this book I just published, Nation States and Violence, which I'll give you a kind of executive summary. Let's just suppose that think of Europe as a state and ask why we should continue, or what's the value of continuing to have Dutch taught in the schools. Now, if everyone in Netherlands were educated in English, they would have the whole world market and the best jobs in the world available to them. Why waste the money in creating a curriculum in Dutch for only a few million people when you can buy much more cheaply educational material from Oxford? So, one answer is that highly educated Dutch people have a preference for their children to have the same culture as they, as a consumption item. Think of it this way. You're educated in Dutch, you've read Dutch literature, you know Dutch jokes, you know Dutch eschatological language to make fun of other people. You want your children to have that same culture. So you graduate from university in Netherlands, and you go anywhere in the world for the best job you can get with your skills. And you can live in America, you can live in Britain, you can live in Australia, you can live in Spain, anywhere with Dutch skills and fluency in English, which comes along with public education in Dutch. Then you get married, and you have kids, and you say to yourself, do I want my kids to be Dutch? Can they be Dutch if we're living in Australia? Even though I have an excellent job here. Maybe I can take a small cut in income and work for a firm in Amsterdam, which may not be the perfect job for me, but then my kids will be in a Dutch school, a Dutch medium school. So it's a small loss in income to have this consumption item called children speaking Dutch. If this is the case, then international firms will say, we should place a technology center in Amsterdam because Dutch people are willing to come back here at somewhat lower wages than in Australia in order to have their kids get a free, publicly supported education in Dutch. So even though they're paying a cost in textbooks, which are redundant, the society is gaining by the commitment of their own young parents to this consumption item, and therefore the whole society is getting richer because these, call them nationalists, are willing to take a small wage cut for their nationalism. So here is a storyline which can explain how the cost of nationalism actually brings macroeconomic benefits. And in the book I showed you, I formalized that into a theoretical model that still requires more statistical tests.
agraïm moltíssim les seves paraules. Ell ha parlat de nord, sud i est-oest, i jo crec que el contacte est-oest, sigui amb sismes o sense, el contacte transatlàntic dona perspectives diferents sobre la nostra realitat. I quan potser és una qüestió de terminologia, de vegades diríem identitat i no nacionalisme, i no té més transcendència, però de vegades realment aquesta visió des de l'altra banda de l'Atlàntic ens ajuda a reflexionar sobre la nostra realitat. Jo crec que la nostra visió d'Amèrica també pot enriquir la visió dels americans sobre la seva realitat. I, per tant, des de tots els punts de vista, crec que intervencions com aquesta d'avui ens ajuden, ni que sigui qüestionant alguns dels supòsits que tenim, ens ajuden a repensar sempre la nostra realitat i ens ajuden també a enfocar el futur amb més optimisme. Per tant, em sembla que reflecteixo l'agraïment de tothom en dir moltes gràcies al professor Laitin i espero que tornarà aviat amb la segona fase dels resultats de les seves recerques, que sembla que són molt prometedores. Moltes gràcies. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you.